Sorry, Rachel. It's telling me it's been signed out because it's used on another computer. Yes, for the audio. In fact, I can just pull it from the YouTube feed.
Oh, perfect. Then that's better. Can I? But even if there's a small delay, I think it might be better than having to try and figure out.
Or do you have the meeting ID for the Zoom? And
Yeah.
I'll use my account.
You can't. I tried that.
I'm sorry. I'll switch one.
Well, it depends, because if it's just with,
Oh, yeah, that's so sad.
Yeah, no, it really is. I'm gonna just check and make sure he was. I had to talk to a different of his today. He didn't say that he was on vacation. But maybe it's just-
That's fine.
okay, so we have quorum, so we should start.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I say it all the time. Yeah. So, they're gonna do, they said they're gonna do it.
Good afternoon.
One more
They
day.
have to turn it on.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the Racial Justice Commission public meeting. I'm Jennifer Jones Austin, and I have the great honor of working with my fellow commissioners and serving as chair. We have a quorum with 6 commissioners present. We expect that a few will join us via I guess, telecommunication, and we may have 1 or 2 other commissioners join us in person. The commissioners who are present include Commissioner Joanne Yu, Commissioner Fred Davey, Commissioner Chris Coy, Commissioner Ana Bermudez, Commissioner Phil Thompson, and as I just said myself, Jennifer Jones Austin. I want to thank all of the chairs for the commissioners. I'm all over the place. I want to thank all of the commissioners for their hard work now, going on more than, I guess, 7-8 months. You've been dedicated to this task, and we are nearing at least the first phase of conclusion, and more will be said about that in just a minute. I want to also thank the staff. Cannot say enough about the staff, ably led by Executive Director Vinka Traman, and just, dynamic individuals who've committed themselves to this work and have really done yeoman's work to get us to where we are. And so I commend all of you, and we'll be hearing a lot from you today. So last week, we launched our fall public engagement sessions. We began with in-person public input sessions at the Brooklyn Museum last Monday, and then we went to the Bronx Wednesday. Now we're in Sunnyside, Queens for this public commissioners meeting. And we will be going back out and having another public input session. We have a virtual session, I believe, Thursday. And we hope to hear from the community during that virtual conversation. So let's get to the business at hand for this meeting. The first order of business, having a quorum, is for us to review and vote on the October 19th, 2021 meeting minutes. The meeting minutes are before everyone, and just would like everybody to take a quick look at them. May I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes of October 19, 2021?
Motion.
Would someone second that motion?
Second.
Okay. Any questions, comments, debate, any proposed changes? Seeing and hearing none, all in favor of the minutes, please state so by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. The meeting minutes for October 19, 2021 have passed. So today we have about a 2.5 hour conversation about the proposals that have been developed by our executive director and by the director of policy for the commission, Jimmy Pan. They've also been reviewed and vetted by our general counsel, Melanie Ash, and by the team. And so what we're going to do is spend some time reviewing each proposal. The staff will give a short presentation, and then we're going to have some dialogue. The aim of this meeting is to have meaningful dialogue about what is being presented to us, to raise critical questions, and to center on, whether or not they are responsive to what we've heard from the community, what we know, what we've heard from thought leaders, and whether these proposals, if acted upon, would help to materially move the needle in advancing equity here in New York City and dismantling structural racism. So dismantling structural racism and advancing equity. I'm going to turn the meeting over to our executive director and to Jimmy Pan, the director. I want to say a few things though before. While we're going to be discussing these proposals as a full body, we're not going to be making formal decisions. This meeting, the aim of this meeting is for us to have that critical dialogue that will help to generate the final proposals, to move us closer to final proposals. And in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we'll be having a vote on the proposals that would go forward as ballot measures, as well as be embodied in the report that will be released in December. We've heard a lot of good ideas from people all across the city of New York. And some of those ideas are going to be presented and others not. The reason that you will not see some is because there are legal and sometimes logistical concerns with some of the ideas and proposals that have been put forward. Some are beyond the power of the commission. And so, what the commission, aims to do, and the staff working with them, is build a roadmap for racial justice. We're not going to be able to do everything in this first go round, but the commission is hopeful, all of you and staff, that we can at least begin to lay a foundation that can be built upon with respect to dismantling racism and advancing true racial justice. Keep in mind that the proposals for charter revision will be presented and voted upon in December. And then once they move to ballot measures, acted upon by the voting community, the electorate, in November of 2022. So I am going to turn the meeting over at this point to our executive director and our policy director to walk us through the presentation and discussion. And again, I just ask that we all listen to the presentation, and then after each proposal is presented, we'll have an opportunity to dialogue. The other thing I just want to note is that our time is limited. So what our aim to do is to make sure that we get through all, to try to center on a presentation and conversation of no longer than 10 to 12 minutes or so to allow for time. Is that correct?
8 to 10.
8 to 10. Oh, 8 to 10. So I'll talk less so that they can get to it. Anusha?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Chair. This is an exciting moment. This is the first time the commission will be discussing in full the proposals that are under consideration. I just want to remind everyone, big picture, how we got here. So as we have been thinking through the values undergirding our work, we endeavored to ensure that every person in New York City has access to opportunity. And we seek to do that by making high-level structural changes that will have a real and ideally measurable impact. So you see on the first slide some of the key criteria and considerations that we have utilized during this process. This will look familiar to you as commissioners. This was a criteria that we, as both staff and the commission, applied in reaching the 10 proposals that you will see today and that we will discuss, in addition to your individual input and feedback. So the first, of course, that it addresses structural racism, in particular, that it shifts and increases power, access, and opportunity for BIPOC communities and individuals. Second, that it creates opportunities for racial justice and advances that vision of a city where race is not determinative of outcomes. Third, that it is a structural level change. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a second. For it has a big impact, or has the potential to have a large impact. And lastly, that it's within the authority of this commission. And our chair spoke to some things that we have heard about that the commission may be interested in that are not necessarily within our authority. And plan for documenting and putting forth those proposals and those recommendations in a racial justice roadmap outside of our proposals for charter revision. In terms of what we mean by structural change, this is really just a reminder, but may also be useful for folks that are listening in and watching remotely. But we're really thinking about the ways that we're altering the way government exercise power, makes decisions, and the way that we're increasing power, access, opportunity for those who have been historically denied that opportunity. I won't go through all of the bullets here, but we bring this up as a reminder as to how we got here, how we're thinking about dismantling structural racism and actualizing that through changes to the charter. So unless there's any questions on that, I think we'll move into the discussion and presentation portion of our meeting today. What we'll do is spend 8 to 10 minutes on each proposal. It's very tight. That includes a very short presentation from our policy director, Jimmy Pan. And then we'll pose some discussion questions. We won't go through them one by one, but There'll be conversation starters. We'll have a timer in the front row, put up a sign when we know we're at that mark. If you're happy to go beyond 6:30, we can go beyond the 8 minutes, but we wanted to provide a marker because we do have a lot to get through today. After we go through each proposal, at the end of the meeting, we'll come to these discussion questions that are on this slide that's up on the screen and should be in front of you, the general discussion questions. 1, do these proposals affect the change that is needed and that we seek? 2, are these proposals, are there any proposals where you think the scope should be expanded or we should go essentially further up the chain to seek a more structural impact? 3, is there additional information that would be helpful for you as we move closer towards decisions? 4, what's missing, what's not here, and why? So we present these questions just to have them in the back of your head before we get into the presentations. And so with that, I will hand it over to our policy director to present on our items. The preamble is in here because it's important, it's foundational to our work, but we won't be discussing it in detail at this meeting.
Maybe not be on. That's all.
It is on.
It is on? It is on? Okay, all right, sorry. I just wanted to, because of the masks, I can't hear very well.
Mhm.
What did you say about, like, we heard so many ideas and things that we believe are, part of the issue of race equity and all that stuff, but that may not be actionable through a charter revision or whatnot, but did you just say that there would be another report kind of highlighting that and sort of?
Yes, or a separate or a component of our final report will be a
Will be that-
racial justice roadmap.
Okay,
There is so much work that we've just begun to touch the surface on this year that we want to put forward as recommendations for things that should continue, areas for further exploration, even recommendations for the next administration, or things that we have considered, but they're not feasible. The path forward may be at another level of government. Those are items that we can note during our discussion, and we want to put forward in that roadmap. Also to reflect that we've heard so many wonderful and impactful ideas from the public. Not all of those are legally feasible within the charter, but we do want to reflect the ones that the commission has great interest in and thinks should be advanced in some way.
thank you.
Before we begin, I just want to recognize for the record that Commissioner Derek Hamilton has joined us. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. All right, Has it stopped? You can hear me? Okay. So with that, I'm going to walk through each proposal very quickly so we can get. But if there are particular details that would be helpful. Hello? Hello? Okay, so I'm just going to go through proposals very quickly, but if there are additional details about each proposal that would be helpful, okay. For the discussion, just let me know and we can provide additional context. So the first thing we'll talk about is a system for making sure that equity is at the center of government decision-making and providing a robust and redundant, set of checks and balances that can make sure that at multiple levels, this work is happening. So one is the Office of Racial Equity, the second is a community-led commission, and the third is a racial equity watchdog. So the first is to make sure the work gets done. The second is to allow the committee to have input into the work that is put together and approve a potential citywide equity plan that is required to pass the budget. And then the third is an independent body that makes sure that all these processes are actually being followed through. You'll see a diagram on the next slide previewing how some of those tasks are to happen and some of how the indicators are to be collected, how the plan will be put together, and where all these checks happen. I'm not going to run through all of that specifically, but again, if anyone wants to discuss any particular point, we can do that during the discussion. And if we go to the next slide, the product of this system, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, the product of this system is the citywide equity plan that every agency generates a part of and combines into the citywide plan. And that citywide plan not only sets forth strategic goals for the city, but also the indicators on how we're going to measure what we mean by success when we say equity. We're going to propose to track that annually and make sure that that's part of what all these bodies and the public can use to hold the city accountable. And again, that the final step in here, the commission is really a last resort when there isn't compliance, when agencies have undergone their training and capacity building, but are still not able to comply with their processes or are unwilling to, then there may be other consequences that we can imagine will make sure that these things happen. So with that, why don't we just move right into the discussion? And Anusha, you'll facilitate.
Sure. We have just a few questions to pose for you, but we're happy to talk about, anything on your mind regarding this potential proposal. Some of our questions for discussion regard the watchdog. How best can we situate it to be powerful and hold entities accountable? Is it most powerful if it is independent or if it reports to one of the citywide elected officials? Two, we're interested in the pros and cons of requiring racial equity plans from some of those other elected officials or elected bodies, including the public advocate, comptroller, borough presidents, potentially even the city council. Lastly, ensuring that what we set up is implemented as effectively as possible into the future. How do we ensure each of these entities is adequately resourced, in the next administration and well beyond? So those are a few questions that we're posing for discussion, but open to any comments, questions you may have.
So if Commissioner state their desire to comment or to question just by raising your hand, that would be very much appreciated. I'm going to begin and say that one of the things that we need to center on is enforceability. That, we have many of these boards, the Board of Correction, we've seen with the CCRB, you can create these watchdog/oversight bodies, but with no meaningful enforceability, they mean absolutely nothing. So we need to center on that as well. What is the enforceability mechanism? If the city is to create a plan and doesn't create a plan, if the city creates a plan but doesn't abide by the terms of the plan, if the city doesn't, put the resources that are necessary into the plan, all of that. So enforceability. Are there questions, comments? Commissioner Davey?
Just a question about, do we know how, to whom or to which agency the IBO reports? I only ask it because it could serve as a model, and I can make a couple other comments on that as well.
I believe they are independent, as their name would suggest, but
Right.
we can confirm.
They're independent, but I guess when it comes to like who determines their level of
Right.
funding,
Right.
that does probably.
Part of the funding is set out in the charter itself. It's tied to the funding for the office manager budget, the percentage.
Yeah. So I like to suggest that might be a model for this this structure that includes these three pieces to it. I'd also just say that CCRB just sort of went through a little notice transition from being a completely reporting to the mayor to reporting to the council and the mayor with the charter change of 2019, I think. Both the city council and the city council speaker and the mayor now appoint the chair, which means that it's sort of, at least on paper, more generally not just a mayoral agency. And then I just point out one other thing, in terms of budget, like the IBO, the CCRB's budget is now tied to percentage of the NYPD's budget. And that was also a charter change. Now, it got suspended because of the COVID emergency, as I think all budgets did, but that is the sort of new rule. And perhaps that could serve as a model for determining the budget structure for this
The
system as
budget
well,
structure and the reporting.
and the reporting.
If I-
CCRB budget is tied to the headcount, and
Yes.
IBO budget is tied to a percentage of budget, so two different kind of structures
Right.
for tying the funding to something else.
Correct.
But something worth taking a look at.
Right.
Definitely. And that reporting requirement as well. Does anybody have any thoughts about the questions presented? We've talked a little bit about reporting.
To me, about report, I'm not sure what, where it should report to, other than to say that it should have, definitely not the mayor. Because then we're kind of in the same business as now. And in terms, in terms of whether this applies to other, yeah, it's what's good for the goose is good for whatever that expression is. You know, and everybody should be held to the same standards. So in that regard, I think it should be comprehensive. I don't know enough about budgets to suggest something, but definitely it's, you know, where we put the money is where the emphasis is going to be, and where we put accountability measures or, you know, like we can't give people, have them be responsible for something if they have no authority over then the outcome or the product. So we have to figure out how to balance that as well.
And a question on the budget. We have split 3 entities. Should a budget calculation or some sort of guaranteed budget exist for all 3 of them?
Yeah, I mean, otherwise they will not be resourced adequately as it is, for example, the Commission on Human Rights. When, I mean, now it's much bigger, but it was tiny.
Right.
And supposedly this was signature law of the city of New York and, you know, and it was a slog to put, you know, have it be the size it is now, and it's still probably under resourced. So, so I think, yeah, I think we have to have budgets for each of them.
If I may just add, Phil, before I don't know, do you want to talk on this point? Okay, let me just quickly before I forget it. We may also want to look at how to protect these budgets, because what often happens when, you know, there's a fiscal crisis or the thought of such, the first places to be cut are these oversight bodies, where they take the same hits as others, and then you lose even more ability to control or address the issues. Phil? Commissioner.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the council has budget power. And so if you put it there, there's the least likelihood of it being cut. So it's just a thought.
I believe Commissioner Yu has a comment.
I'm just thinking out loud, but you know, I think about the language access law, right? And you know, all of the agencies that are required. And when we hear about updates, you know, not many are doing them, but there are a lot of consequences, right? And you are required. And so I feel like, you know, I think about how we apply, how this will be applied. If we're going to apply it like, you know, if it's going to implement it like language access, everybody knows it's vital, right? But what's, you know, I guess I'm just interested in, you know, the consequences of not doing it, because the consequences of, you know, not, fully implementing language access is that a lot of people don't have the information that they need, right? And so what's the, you know, the implications of not, you know, not adopting and not enforcing what we put down here. I think that's something that I'm thinking about.
If we may share some of what the staff has been working on regarding the citywide equity plan. So this would be under the mayor or responsibility of the mayor so that it is prioritized. The production of it could be led by Chief Equity Officer, and the Office of Racial Equity would coordinate across agencies. Now that would be delivered to multiple entities, you know, it could go to City Council, Public Advocate and whatnot. But perhaps most importantly, it would go to the commission, and the commission would have a role in reviewing, commenting, and essentially certifying that the plan is complete. We've been thinking about that as it interacts with the budget process, both in timeline and content, as well as, you know, perhaps it needs to be approved in order for the budget for the year to be enacted. So those are some of the things that the staff has been researching and exploring in terms of the consequences.
One thing I would ask of commissioners, not necessarily in this meeting, but, you know, over the course of the next couple of days, as you spend some more time with these proposals, take a look at some of the details and provide feedback. So on this slide where you see, you know, kind of the structure and some of the specifics about the a description of the roles and responsibilities, just spend a little time with that to give the staff some feedback. Good deal? Any other, Commissioner Coy?
Yeah, in terms of the watchdog, my leaning will be more independent because of it's like in terms of the watchdog, I'm leaning towards more like being independent because it's like it tends to be more like this under any mayor or controller or city council get caught up in the political process. I feel, you know? So I mean that's my comments on that.
Good. Are we good?
So, well,
Please.
I know we have time issues, but I'm like kind of a visual person. So in terms of the timeline, right? So if we have a chief equity officer, the Office of Racial Equity, that then that's where the equity plan resides. And you said it's then passed on to the commission to be able to sort of give its stamp of approval. A lot of those processes can get bogged down with, I mean, because this is going to be a massive report in a way. This is like probably twice the MMR in a way. And that is a well-oiled machine by now, but I'm wondering what it will take to make it a well-oiled machine so that we don't bog down also other city processes that need to happen, right? And then it gets blamed for stuff and then we get you know, that we see what's happening and et cetera, et cetera. And it gets seen then more of an obstacle than a solution. So for me, it would be great to be able to look at what a timeline might look like since you guys have been talking about it. And then, you know, I think how the Office of Racial Equity gets staffed with what, because one of the things that as I was reading these, the Office of Language Access, if we can centralize a lot of stuff that agencies can have as resource. So anybody who needs translation of any of their documents goes to the central entity that's in the Office of Racial Equity and that gets funded and that gets, you know, half the time I don't have the money, for example, as an agency to translate into the 20 languages that I probably should. And so I do 3, you know, depending on what, right? And I'm not in compliance probably, but it's a struggle, you know, budget wise, it's a struggle. So if we prioritize those things by centralizing and giving resources to the agencies to be able to disseminate information, et cetera, and have access as part of this racial equity office, I think that would be beneficial.
Absolutely. Great points in terms of timeline. We can work on that and share that with the commission. In terms of centralizing access to things like translation, we have another proposal that actually goes deeper into that. So, you know, I think we can discuss that further when we get to that point.
Okay. I'll just add that, Aisha, and talking about this possibly being a biannual plan, not a yearly plan, because just the time to implement and then to assess. So just throwing that out there in case people have thoughts on that. Commissioner Hamilton?
Thinking about our chair's provocation of looking at the slide with the tripariate system, one thing I just want us to be cognizant of is in the past, the ways in which tools to promote equity over time can be perhaps misused and co-opted in ways that were not our original intent. So I would alert us to be sure to emphasize the economic rights, economic material access when our concepts of equity, which I think makes it a little more lock solid from co-optation.
Very much appreciated. All right, I think we're ready to move to the next proposal.
All right, the next proposal is racial equity budget scoring. The underlying theory here is that when we put out the budget, which is supposed to be a document representing the values and priorities of the city, it's given a fiscal score, but it's not necessarily scored for equity. So as part and parcel of our proposal that the budget itself align with the citywide equity plan, if we move forward with this, we would task a body with developing a methodology or adopting a methodology to score sections of the budget so that there's a public facing documentation of what the city is prioritizing and how it fits in with equity, and have an easier way to align the citywide equity budget with, or citywide equity plan with the budget itself. We could also contemplate having an independent body like the IBO, the Independent Budget Office, perform a review of that methodology and check that alignment.
Thoughts?
Well, I always like to go to the one that should it apply to the city council? Yes. When we do,
So if you, I mean, one of the thoughts here is that the racial equity budget scoring would then create, an enforceability and accountability mechanism. So the plans aren't just sitting out there and, they understand that there's a budget responsibility attached to them. And if they don't adhere to that, then they're out of compliance. It's just trying to build in accountabilities. And one thought here you'll see on the other page is whether or not is whether this proposal should actually be integrated into the tripartite system proposal overall as part of the racial equity work, and not sit independent. Commissioner Hamilton?
Yeah, just want to comment on, applaud this proposal and talk about some of the really good usefulness of it in that it sets benchmarks, it sets political accountability, it allows for values to be determined. We know that budgets reflect values. So we highlight things like fiscal implications. So this is setting of values that we value racial inclusion, gender inclusion, equity inclusion, as much as we do fiscal, at least as much as fiscal accountability. So I really like this and think it's useful in multiple ways.
Commissioner Hamilton, may I ask what you believe the methodology should be? Should we be specific, or should we set out in the proposal that one should be determined? What might that look like?
Yeah, the difficult part is that it's going to require dynamic scoring in a similar way that fiscal budgeting requires dynamic scoring. So there's some limitations on how prescribed you can be. I think it becomes useful in putting the elements of things that we should consider when we do it, but the actual algorithm is something that will probably change depending on context.
I mean, I don't know if this is too simple, but like one way, for example, that this can be implemented is like, so let's say agencies claim like they have, let me take ACS. Well, the number of children in foster care has gone down tremendously from 50,000 to 20,000. But when you look at the communities of color, like certain communities, right? The percentage is much higher. That ratio has not subsided, right? When I claim that people, we have successful rates of probation that are great, are they also great in the communities where they're most challenged by, all mass incarceration, et cetera, et cetera? So, I don't know whether then that's something about not just the racial equity plan, but we have to demonstrate, each agency has to demonstrate that whatever outcomes, positive outcomes they have are being replicated in the communities where the most inequities exist, however we want to, sort of define that. As opposed to looking at things always citywide.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Question.
Here, let me just, before you begin, recognize that Commissioner Vice Chair Henry Garrido has joined us along with Commissioner K-Bay.
So not to belabor the issue, the nomenclature here, but you mean by units of appropriation as opposed to 4 units of appropriation? And the reason is because the way that the budget works, once you create the units of appropriations are there, if it's for them, right, it's supposed to buy them. I think it changes the meaning and the context. There are significant amount of units of appropriation. So if you're gonna do it by them, that's a pretty high task, as opposed to do it by agency through department. So I just wanted a clarification on that language.
Yeah, I think that would depend on the methodology that is adopted. I think that if there's a aggregate score that could be done on a per agency basis, and that's what will be used. But if they have a greater ability to conduct an equity score by unit of appropriation, as you said, that's very granular, and we don't know if that such a methodology exists now. But if we could get that granular, then perhaps that could be part of it as well. But we haven't made that decision.
So a unit of appropriation is the OTPS, other than personnel services. You wouldn't want equity and inclusion there. I mean, so I think it needs to be clarified that we're talking about people here, not objects. And so to the extent that language should be more about equity and inclusion, about delivering services, for instance, or concentrating on people services, I think that would be helpful.
Very helpful. Commissioner Thompson and then Commissioner Davey.
Yeah, I have a question as to, I'd love it if to see some examples of where this has actually been put in practice, to have some sense of what it means to do, because I can't in my head even figure out like how one would do this and what would be covered. I assume not everything can be covered, but how those choices have been made in other places. And it would also help me to answer the earlier question about whether this should be folded into the tripartite or, be done separately.
So I think that's a fair point. I'll just, off the top of my head, comes to mind. If you have a racial equity that requires resources, and you put the plan forward, but you don't put any resources, you don't attach resources to it, then, essentially, what does it take? Just as we've experienced most recently with the Build Back Better plan, as an example. How much, that's what comes through. We're talking about something similar. That's one of, how much would this plan cost? And is the city committing the resources to fully fund it? If the city's just putting the plan out there, but not attaching dollars to it or not evidencing city forward, then that's a lack of commitment. I'm just using that as one example.
We're happy to share what we have gathered from other cities that have varied models. we've touched base with some cities to learn about their model. They're different to varying effects. I won't name names of any of the cities here, but we're happy to share that. Some of that I think is already in the briefs that we've shared as well, so we'll recirculate it. Some of our other commissioners may have some thoughts to share on other cities' existing models and effectiveness overall.
We're pretty much coming up on time for this proposal, but Commissioner Davey, did you have a comment or question?
I don't want to take us astray of this discussion, but I was trying to decipher a little bit more about the meaning behind the second question we have up here. Should racial equity scoring also be required for the city council as part of the legislative process? Just curious if you could talk just a little bit more about what you mean by that.
So every piece of city council legislation needs to undergo a fiscal impact assessment. Should there be something similar for racial equity assessment? And that could take the form of a scoring or a more qualitative assessment. But that's a question that we wanted to pose in terms of the scope of this proposal.
I'm trying to indicate whether those nods are kind of like, I understand what you're saying, or yes, that's something that should be done.
Yes.
Okay. Good deal.
All right, so the next proposal we want to talk about today is the true cost of living standard. So this proposal would require the city to develop a new additional standard that accurately reflects the cost of living. And part of that is because the existing federal standard is quite antiquated and it doesn't take into account things like cost of housing, cost of transport, cost of childcare. And so when we use the existing model, even as a frame of reference to talk about the state of poverty in the city or the state of how much service is needed in the city, it doesn't provide the clearest picture. And so this proposal would be to understand what the true cost of living is in the city, report it in the citywide equity plan, and then make sure that it is reported as part of what the city does when it's reporting out the state of poverty for New Yorkers.
Any comments or questions on this one?
Yeah. Just for clarity's sake, we're talking about poverty measures and, right, separately, other factors that go in, right, that should be considered in a way that a consumer price index, for instance, is regionalized to add for what the original cost would be, right? Are we saying, quite frankly, the federal median income that measures poverty in the way that we apply here in New York is insufficient? And perhaps the city should look at it as opposed to cost of living. Are we looking at the standard measures, right? Or are we looking at a combination of that plus more?
So the way that I think about this is that what we're doing, the federal poverty measure, just like sometimes the best way to describe this, the federal poverty measure says that a family of 4 anywhere in this nation needs just $26,000, $26,500 to technically not be living in poverty. Here in New York City, a family of 4 in the Bronx needs, like it's been determined, needs at like close to $100,000. When you work off of the federal poverty measure, that helps to set or to suppress wages. It helps to, because essentially, it says to somebody, if a family of 4 is making $26,500, they're not in poverty, they're doing okay. But you can't pay your housing costs, you can't pay for food costs, childcare costs, et cetera. It also, the federal poverty measure is used to drive income support allocations. So if you are in New York City and you are at 200% of poverty, means that you're twice the level of poverty as a family of 4 at $52,000 a year. You may be eligible for childcare, but if you make $56,000 a year in your family of 4, you're not going to get the childcare. So what a true cost of living measure does was essentially it helps to address the issue of wage inequity, wage disparity. It helps to provide kind of power in terms of negotiation about what fair wages are to cover basic household costs. The federal poverty level measure is really measuring deprivation. It's not really measuring what it costs to live. And it does not look at geographical distinctions with respect to how much it actually costs. The other thing that it does, as I just said, is that it drives income support. So we have many people in New York City, and primarily Black and brown people and Black and brown women, who are not age eligible for certain benefits because they make more than the federal poverty level, or they go beyond 200%, but they're still struggling. And it's been identified as a true racial inequity issue because disproportionately it is women of color in lower wage jobs who, like if the government can say that this is adequate and we only need to go but so far when it comes to income supports, then it is they who continue to live in poverty or struggle, and their children live in poverty, and the cycle just continues. So what this is intended to do is to, at least at a minimum, give a true accounting of what it actually costs to live in New York City. And then it helps to begin to change the power structure and change the conversation and narrative about what we as a city should be doing by way of income supports, wages, and the like.
Just a follow-up question. So then the language, instead of understand, are we talking about addressing as opposed to understanding?
Just want to note that Commissioner Yesenia Mata has joined us virtually. Good to have you. Are there questions or comments on this one? This is, I'll just say this last point, because I've been centering myself looking at a lot of this. This is what structural racism looks like. It's these laws that are on the books or these ways of doing business that perpetuate inequity and you don't really see it. And so the lie or the narrative keeps getting told year after year after year. When we get to say as a city that we reduced poverty because the minimum wage has increased across the state of New York, but we know that $2, $3 doesn't really make a difference. And women of color in lower wage jobs are suffering the most. That's how you be good at these things, my opinion.
Part of my tardiness, and I'm having, I don't know, maybe my old age, I'm having difficulty hearing and understanding. It might be me. I know we're being safe with our masks. In the way that it's presented, I think understanding is a part of it, is the beginning stage, and there has to be the addressing, as you point out. Because I don't know, my mic might not be on, they said?
No, it's not.
It's on,
It's on.
it's on.
Okay. So I don't understand how the federal standard was put into place. I'm not sure if it was done in a thoughtful, in a way that builds legacy, that thinks about the historic oppression that happens across the country, but I would like to understand what logic was used, because I don't. And I look at the numbers, as you point out, Madam Chair, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in New York, but it doesn't make sense around the country. So who defines poverty? How do we define it, right? And who suffers based on those definitions is the question. And then we're talking about New York City and the cost of living here as opposed to other geographies around the country. That's an entirely different conversation. So I think there's a lot that can be unpacked in this work.
So as a friendly amendment, are we saying on this? Oh, sorry.
Commissioner Hamilton?
I mean, I'm going to echo my commissioners and say I +1 everything they said, and just add another usefulness of this is New York City leads. New York City sets an example. New York City, first and foremost, we want to get it right. So if the measures right now are antiquated and inaccurate, let's do better and get it right. But then the other part is we set an example by which others will emulate and lead to more justice elsewhere.
I guess my
Hold on
question
one second,
is,
Commissioner, one second, Commissioner
sorry.
Garrido had a comment.
Yeah, I apologize for the interruption. I just wanted to add if the words understand and address so that we cover both sides of the
Okay.
comments
Mhm.
would work.
Absolutely. And this is not the exact language that would go in the charter either.
We're getting close though. Commissioner Yu?
I guess I have a practical question. I agree with all what my fellow commissioners are saying, but some of the funding that we get from the federal government requires us to use their standards, right? And
Mhm.
so sometimes they say it's like a weird mix and match. And so the excuse has always been, oh, it's because it's federal funding, we have to do this, right? And so, how do we overcome that? I think we are absolutely in agreement that, if we reject it, I think we think about that, right? But then are they gonna pull the funds away? I don't know. I'm gonna
No,
ask
so
my
keep in
fellow
mind-
economist here.
Right, but
sitting
keep
next
in
to me.
mind, that we're looking at it as a new additional standard. And just as Commissioner, so it's a new additional standard. We're not saying that it's now we're going to reject money or we're going to have money withheld from us because we're adopting and embracing a new standard in place of the federal poverty measure. But what we're seeking to do is to begin to change the narrative and influence and impact. And keep in mind, everything is not just tied. All income supports aren't just tied to a federal poverty measure. In New York City, we use income supports for city tax levy dollars. And then the other thing is that this is not necessarily just tied to income supports. You can look at it as how it affects and influences wages. But to Commissioner Hamilton's point, if we can lead the nation in calling out this blatant lie, maybe we can begin to change what's happening across the nation.
There are absolutely efforts underway to change how the federal government calculates the poverty measures, so we will be heading in that direction. In the discussion questions, you'll see that we also pose that, should this proposal include the prohibition on the use of the federal poverty measure, except where required by law?
So that is
The question that we put forward to the commission for consideration, and whether the proposal should and to what degree it requires the city to use this standard both for reporting and for
eligibility for services.
benefits and so on.
Commissioner
So
Davey?
again, that's just a little confusing to me. Which standard? So on the one hand, you said, should we prohibit the use of the federal standard unless required by law?
Mhm.
And then the second question, should we use the standard?
That's correct.
My question is, which standard?
Thanks for the clarification. In the second question, we're referring to our proposal of the
The
true
new
cost of living
standard. The
standard.
new
Mhm.
standard, great.
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions or comments about this one? Commissioner Peters, I feel like I'm at an auction with you. Put your hand through your hair. I didn't know if that was indicating you had a question. Are we good to move on? Okay.
Our next proposal here is looking at wage segregation in the city. So this is going beyond looking just at pay equity. Within titles, there's a question of whether someone doing the same work is getting the same pay, right? But there's also another dynamic within city, and especially the city workforce, of even if you're in a different title, but you're doing work that requires, let's say, equivalent skills, experience, effort, are you getting paid less because you occupy a position that is predominantly done by women of color, for example, or women? And so there isn't that analysis done on the city level right now. So we don't know what the state of that is. And it's not clear in the city's law as it's written that that is discrimination under which the current Commission on Human Rights can bring enforcement. They might, but we don't know. Perhaps that hasn't been brought yet to our knowledge. And so the proposal here would be to explicitly call that out as something that is discriminatory, and then require city entities, such as those promulgating personnel rules and promotional rules, to put in place rules that address that issue specifically, as well as make sure that there's equitable hiring and promotion in the city. And then empowering the independent EEPC, which is the Equal Employment Practice Commission, to actually have an enforcement power over the city. So what they do right now is they audit the city for practices, but they don't have an enforcement power. And so this is really 3 different ways to get at the issue of occupational wage segregation. And we're proposing them here in concert, but we can discuss, whether that feels like, the right approach, or simply just clarify this proposal as well. I know it's not maybe the most straightforward.
Commissioner Hamilton?
So my query might be coming from a place of ignorance. I've certainly committed to the value of ensuring that people have access to occupations in an equitable way and not sorted by race. So the collecting of data and charging agencies to monitor this and enforce discrimination, but isn't it discriminatory to sort people into an occupation based on their race or gender?
I think it would be to sort them, right? But I think the issue that we're trying to address is whether positions are being paid a differential wage because the title is predominantly occupied by a particular set of people, right? So let's say home care workers are being paid much less than an equivalent position that isn't primarily done by women of color, but they're getting paid 20K less.
That clarification is very useful and I like it a lot. So in some ways, it's a proposal to redress structural discrimination that our current configurations of individual discrimination are inadequate. And there needs to be a more structural lens.
This may be a question for Mr. Garita, because even when it looks like 2 titles have different, pay scales, and then within a title, people doing, of different races may look like they make different money. Isn't all tied to, not everything, I suppose, but a lot of it tied to collective bargaining and the steps and all that stuff that looks bad. And when you look at it, it's the way the system is set up. So is that system, can we tackle that system at all first?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes and no.
Right.
So longevity, for instance, takes a long place. Professional qualifications would allow for salary ranges. For instance, in city agencies, I'm talking specifically to jobs of the city, you can have a range that go from 50 to 80,000 as an example, $30,000 from the minimum to the maximum. And the idea is that if you have certain skills or certain things that the city has, licenses is one of them, that you should be closer to the top of the range. In principle, that works. In application, what we have seen is that depending who's the one doing the interview, or the one who is doing the appointment, there could be discrimination where we have seen vast differences in salaries between the minimum and the maximum that are not tied to any kind of licenses or additional skills, but rather to the judgment of whoever's making the hiring.
Or a mandate from certain places that for fiscal prudence, everybody should be hired at the lower level regardless.
Correct.
And
We've
then
seen
it
that.
creates a.
So I think that what we do in collective bargaining is try to come up with these additional things and separate them from the minimum to the maximum. That's the new strategy. Separate them in the sense that you have longevity pay, you have step pays, you have things that are associated with licenses that are not so within the range that allow for certain judgment calls, but more fixed to, let's say, if you're licensed architect or PE, you will get a differential for specific amount for that licenses. As opposed to say, the range of salary, for example, would be between 50 and 80. Right. And somebody will be making the judgment Who gets 50 and who gets 80?
And how effective is that? How effective, how would you say that has been, is currently?
I think it's been very inefficient.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're looking at discrimination in segregated titles, very specifically, it's one of the areas that we have the biggest problems. Women, okay, of color, minorities have been for years, in my opinion, and the evidence show it, disenfranchised when all matters are the same. So when you have people who are all qualified for the same position, they get hired, but then they get paid less than the white male counterparts, as an example. And I think that as long as you have that judgment being made at that level, we're gonna have a problem. I think that's what this is trying to address.
I think historically, whenever white people have been allowed to have discretion as it pertains to what we can do in communities of color and wealth, we have seen a pattern that we have been left out. So I agree. And my thought process is protective. Like, so when I'm looking at this, I'm saying, say, how are we protecting the next 3 steps? How are we protecting what's going to happen in terms of the oppression that you can anticipate due to the discretion that's embedded in white privilege? That's the process I'm trying to walk through as I'm reading this and listening to you.
You know, to your point, just building on your point, I just want to respond to that real quickly. Is what we need to do with this proposal is to think about like the if then, you know, what follows through, what are the loopholes, what are the, you know, points of issue, points of concern that could be triggered by this action. We need to think about that. Commissioner Thompson.
Yeah, my comment was going to be along those lines, like, how would you actually discover whether there is or there is not occupational segregation? So what kind of analysis would be necessary?
Where it's been done, you might have an external group come in and evaluate the titles and say, this title requires, you know, this amount of skill, this amount of education, this amount of effort, and then canvass other titles that may require similar amounts of skill, effort, experience, and look to see whether there's any pay differential there based on, you know, the demographic population of those titles. So there are groups that are starting to do this work and develop that methodology to do so. And I'll also just add that, you know, I made reference to women of color and other women, but of course, this would apply across, you know, a wide spectrum of identities, including, you know, different gender expression.
Could you look at this issue through civil service exams as well?
I think you could. I think what's difficult is whether there's data collection to analyze the effect of those civil service exams and what the outcomes are. And so what we're proposing here is to have clear rules to evaluate the effect of different exams. So we can have.
And I'll just quickly, like I'm thinking, like if you have somebody who takes the civil service exam for the fire department, for the NYPD, and then they take the, just, you know, the general civil service exam to become an employee of the city of New York. And you see that, you know, you have more, it's skewed for people of color, you see more people of color moving into the human services agencies with the civil service and not getting the scoring that they need in the fire department or the NYPD. Does that speak itself to maybe, you know, kind of raising the flag around occupational segregation? Are the tests structured in such a way? I'm just using.
Yeah, I think I disagree with Jimmy's assessment. I mean, a position on this, because for one, the civil service test does not ascertain salary. It's a ranking situation.
Right.
I think, and I want to separate the issue. Secondly, because that is under the state rule. So the state civil service department approves or denies the plans as submitted by the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. I think to your point, however, if we were going to address point systems that have, you know, for years trying to add value, that have created inequities and discrimination in the way we rank a system that was intended to be about merit and fitness, I think you're right on point. And very specifically, we see in the uniforms, legacy systems that allowed for additional sort of like a point system for people whose families have been there before. That's a very prime example of that. But I think it's salaries, the civil service exam, the civil service rules do not take any effect on salaries. You know, once you're ranked, you're selected, unless you're directly certified, direct certification, you go to the next line and then you're hired. Then, so the difference is between appointment and then pay upon hiring. I don't think you can do the latter.
So perhaps there's some value in looking into the occupational segregation piece. Let's maybe explore that a little bit more. Are you guys with us?
I didn't hear that last
I
part.
was saying that we should give some, explore more, give some greater consideration to the occupational segregation. So occupational wage segregation is an element, can be an element of occupational segregation. And maybe we need to be looking at occupational segregation. Why is it that in the human services, civil service titles, you see more persons of color, maybe coming into those positions than you do in the uniformed officer positions? What is driving that? Just as in, or certain departments within the city of New York, as opposed to others? What is driving that? If an exam is what, one has to take in order to at least achieve an entry-level status. Commissioner Hamilton?
I mean, going back to Phil's query, my understanding of occupational crowding segregation is one of, you look at skill sets for specific types of occupations or jobs and the share of populations with that skill set, and then the degree of representation within that particular job, given they have that skill set. Are they over under, right?
Right.
But so I actually think this is innovative, useful, and cutting edge, because, and I like how it's framed in that in addition to our discrimination laws, we need other mechanisms to look at something that's more structural. So taking an accounting, a review of the jobs throughout the city and examining the extent to which they are representative or not, independent of skills, is a really useful tool. Some of the questions become, what is the mechanism of enforcement once you uncover that this is a problem? It's hard to bring individual lawsuit because of the nature of the problem. And I'm not sure if it's a class action lawsuit, and maybe the litigation is not the way we want to go anyway. But I would say we think about enforcement and then add another element. Even beyond salary, COVID-19 has shown us that workplace safety and other attributes as it relates to job become relevant and important also as a criteria to examine beyond wages in doing this analysis.
Hi, I don't know if you all can hear me.
Other questions or comments, points on this one?
I just want to say that I'm dealing with an issue right now with its prime example where the application of this concept, it's so important, so relevant, and it has to do with emergency dispatch, right? If 911 operator, 90% of Black women of color or women of color who are in the 911 dispatching, the ambulance dispatcher or the fire dispatchers are mostly white and mostly male, and yet they get paid significantly more. And they're basically doing the same dispatching, working in the same building, same PSAC building, both in Brooklyn and up in the Bronx. And the challenge I always get representing one group is that, well, this group has uniform status under the state law, and then this group doesn't. Well, we just got the 911 operators doing absolutely the same thing, dealing with emergencies, right? Call comes in on 911, whether you get it because you need a fire truck or a police truck, the questions are basically the same, the pressures are the same, the hours are size. That's a prime example of the same idea, same skills, same conditions, and yet for whatever other reasons, The emergency dispatchers on fire and EMS make $20,000 more than the 911 operator dispatchers within the same city.
Right, so and so that's picking up on some of what I'm saying. What is that? What is driving that? What are what's at the root of that in terms of what allows for that and digging into that? Okay, Commissioner Mata has a question and then we'll come to Commissioner Davis.
Hi, can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. My question was, I believe to Jimmy, he indicated about a focus group being part of this process to understand the inequities of the compensation to women, specifically to women of color. I just wanted to add a suggestion to that. I also want to hear more about what happens once the women are hired, right? For example, from my experience as a woman of color, has been really hard to get into certain places. And once I do, in order for me to move up to the next level, in order for me to show, hey, I do need a raise, it's even harder to prove that, even though I have that track record. So I guess one of my suggestions is to add what happens after you are hired. What other difficulties you continue having in the workplace or in the specific section you're in to even continue going higher, because once you're hired, it doesn't stop there. There's still many inequities along the way. So that's just one of my suggestions.
Point and begin to get at that in your second point, right? Okay. Commissioner Davey?
I'm just, again, curious about the proposal to make occupational segregation discrimination illegal. I assume that what Vice Chair Garrido just described is something that would technically be illegal. Who makes it illegal? Is it the council that votes legislation? Is it based on
legislation? And there is some looking at same work, same pay.
right? So how would we do it, just by way of an example, in a proposal coming out of this commission?
I think we could do it by creating a section in the charter that sets forth the value of that first and foremost, of, that people should be paid the same thing for similar difficulty in work, similar skill set work, and then put in something that says, the human rights law has to be amended or will be amended to include this as a criteria for discrimination, and then have an enforcement mechanism in there.
So I just want to comment that what I'm hearing, at least maybe what I'm hearing myself say, and I think I've heard a little bit from others, is that this is not just about wage segregation. This is about wage and job segregation, and that this proposal needs to speak to both.
Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Hamilton.
I mean, building on Commissioner Davies' point, I guess the difficulty that I see, and if my interpretation is the ability to bring suit through the courts for something like this, because it's structural. It's not individual acts of discrimination as described. So can we come up with a mechanism of enforcement beyond just calling it illegal?
I can speak to that a little bit. There's a law in New Zealand that does exactly that. That was passed last year. I'm not sure how effective it's been because it's only been in effect for a year, but that could be one model if we want to have private enforcement. But of course, we can also contemplate city enforcement, just like right now the City Human Rights Commission enforces the city human rights law in an administrative way.
Another challenge that comes to mind is in the phenomenon of white flight. So I remember a time when the post office was white men And then I saw a time when that shifted and changed. But then I heard that the benefits, some of the things that the post office and that type of labor for were removed, or it had changed and transformed. And so the people of color had access to it. I look at law enforcement, which you see an increase over the years in Black and brown officers, women officers. But when you look at the top percentile, the true leadership, the top brass of NYPD, there has been very little to no change on a lot of those levels statistically. So I think about the fact that when we get into these positions and we insert these requirements, there's an escape route that happens. So similar to what Vice Chair said, there'll be a compartment established in which whiteness and privilege is protected. And we'll be talking about equity in our small circle of Blackness and brownness.
Commissioner Thompson and then Commissioner Davey.
Yeah, I would just like to know at some point what the budget implications of this could be or would be. And also, I'd like some insight into what the labor negotiation impacts of this would be. For example, I know some preschool teachers or, pre-K teachers are in UFT, they make one salary. I know others are in nonprofits, they make another salary. And so I'd like to just play this out, or at least have some opportunity to think it through. What does this mean? And how will it impact?
And to your point, I appreciate the point that you're making. And I struggle with that point, right? Because, doing what is right, what is morally and ethically right, sometimes comes with a bigger dollar, the bigger price tag. Do we not act on what addresses or helps to achieve greater equity because of the price tag attached to it, or do you build in a process by which you get there? Right, and I'm not suggesting that you're saying that you don't, because you're saying let's just understand it, maybe, but I'm just saying that I think that that's something that we also just have to take into consideration as a deliberating body. Commissioner Davey, unless you have a different point?
Yes.
Do you want to just comment on that, Commissioner Rita, before?
Yeah, I just want to say the price tag of equalizing this would be significant. As an example of that, when the Communication Workers of America sued over the issue promotions for managers who traditionally have been bypassed, they went through the EO commission, and the federal EO issued an early determination that was almost $450 million for about 9,000 managers who have been bypassed, have been hired, promoted, and yet giving less salary than their counterpart. That's just a small session. The teacher of equity, the title, for instance, was a huge amount of money. We came up with ways to deal with it by cutting in pieces and by using some of the labor reserves in order to equalize the salaries of teachers. And hopefully in a year and a half or so, when we complete this deal, we'll be on par when it comes to salaries. When it comes to compensation, it's a whole different story. I think that this proposal, the way I see it, it's more like the what. You make occupational segregation and the discrimination, the who, in this case, DCAS, promulgating rule, and then the how, in this case, would be the EO, the Equal Opportunity Practice Commission, as the enforcement arm of that process. I think what's missing, though, is that the first group, to Commissioner Mata's point, DCAS only covers certain agencies. So if you're dealing with it, making the discrimination, what's missing in my part is what, if any, what be the other agencies to enforce private sectors who are doing this and other agencies that are not covered by DCAS, right? The non-mayoral agencies, for instance, that we have no control of, DCAS doesn't, right? And also things like the housing authority and all that stuff not covered. So we could be clear, just so we're clear, it may be that this is it, this is how much the city has control over, And I'm fine with that, but I wanted to make sure that the first premise in the city making it illegal, it's missing that it is within the scope of the city's power.
And I would just add that I just really want to understand the scope too. DOH nurses in schools make less money than UFT nurses in schools. You know, I just would like to know how far this goes so we can have some sense of like what we're talking about.
Very well understood. Yeah, I don't want to belabor the point. I mean, it's the ever-present question about, what is the driver? And it gets back to kind of like your fiscal policies and your value base and your beliefs. And I'm not suggesting that you're saying that, you're just saying you want to understand the cost, but we have to be, I personally, we have to be very, very, while mindful of costs. What has happened in this society is that we've allowed costs to drive decisions about who should have what and who's entitled to what. And the persons who always are on the, have the short end of the stick are largely persons of color. And so just trying to figure out what is our role and responsibility in this moment. Commissioner Davey?
It's a slight shift of gears, and it's sort of a broader suggestion, and that is that we are making proposals, at least initially, that will require new entities and maybe new regs and changes in law, city and state maybe, and changes in regs. So might be helpful to have and I don't want to put more work on the staff that's already done an incredible amount of work and high quality work, but it might be helpful to have a chart. So we chart out what's the new entity that's being proposed. What are the regs related to that entity? What are the laws related to that entity? What would need to change? And then what are the budget implications of that new entity?
Absolutely. We have much more information we can share.
Great, thank you.
We ready to move on to the next?
We are. I know we spent a lot of time on this one, but I think it was very helpful to help further refine the concept.
Okay, the next proposal to discuss tonight is one on strengthening fair share. So fair share is a standard that exists within the city as guidelines on how the city should site its new buildings. So the proposal here would make sure that those guidelines become mandatory and that they're regularly updated and that they're updated to include an equity frame to them. So as they stand right now, they haven't been updated since 1991, I believe. And when they are treated as guidelines, and so if a siting doesn't comport with them, there's no repercussion on it.
Jimmy, can I ask a favor? Can you pull your mask down when you speak? It's really like we just get like Charlie Brown grown up
Okay.
thing here.
No, it's okay. All right. The other part of the proposal is to make sure that not only is there a fair share methodology applied at the time of making the siting decision, but upstream of that, when we're doing capital planning and making broader decisions about where to invest in the next decade, that there's an equity frame brought in there to make sure that that process also aligns with the citywide strategy that we'll put forward in the citywide equity plan.
Yeah, question I have is like, what happened even afterward? Is it like, what's enforcement in a sense of consequences? If say a project that doesn't meet, the new alignment, can it be disqualified? Or right now it's like this seems like not much of a consequences in a sense, because then, you could just say, hey, we have no other choice, and then the commission would vote on it or something. So, I mean, what is the enforcement after?
Yeah, I think there could be different types of enforcement. I think the default that people think of when they think of fair share would be a private litigant, someone bringing a court case to stop a development. But, you can see that if that's not really controlled for, then it can stop a lot of things that are happening in the city. So we can come up with potentially different ways to stop that process, until there's enough of until there's enough of an actual fair share analysis and a demonstration of why that particular thing is actually necessary. So the enforcement could just be slowing it down until there's enough kind of proof done to show why an exemption is necessary. Or the traditional route, again, is a private litigant.
Introducing the mandatory component is a significant change in terms of how the criteria, even once updated, would be considered, because those criteria are considered, but then there's also other considerations that might ultimately drive the location or, whatnot. So I think that in itself provides some enforcement where there might be some baseline criteria that have to be met, and then others that can be considered. So that is a change in status quo.
Just
Or
a
that
point of
maybe, there might
clarification.
be like, the agency has to, or the city has to provide like 3 choices or something, there might be a way of dealing with it.
Commissioner Garrido and then Commissioner.
Yeah, I just a point of clarification. Who would do this? This is add a charter to identify neighborhood with the put. Who in the charter? Who in the city?
In terms of the updating, we,
No,
She's
I'm
saying she's
I'm
still
talking
in fair
about,
share.
yeah, I got it. I'm talking about
Yeah.
identifying neighborhood.
I mean, so right now there are many agencies that cite facilities or site services in facilities. So, it might be DCAS, it might be DEP, it might be sanitation. They all end up coordinating to a certain extent with the Department of City Planning. So all of those agencies, any agency that does any sort of citing would have to comply with this.
Commissioner Davey.
I might be a page ahead. Are we,
I think that,
so I'll wait.
right, I think some, like, the way that they're set up, they look like they're one and the same,
Yeah,
but one is about fair share and the other one
that's
about fair
about fair
share.
care. Yep, I have one. about
Any other questions on fair share?
Yeah, when it says here balancing strictness with flexibility, that I want to understand that a little better.
Yeah, so, in thinking through having criteria that both could be updated over time and can work in a variety of situations, it's complex figuring out, not only which is the community that you want to service by citing a new facility, what are the potential implications on the local neighborhood. We want to make sure that there is some flexibility. It's not so rigid that ultimately things don't get cited. That might be a benefit or even a responsibility or a burden. So there's definitely a need to be nuanced and sensitive. And this is also where, we wouldn't update those rules directly through the charter revision, but require that they be updated. So when Fair Share was introduced in the city charter in 1989, City Planning Commission was required to promulgate these rules, but only once. There's no requirement or option to update them over time.
But say assuming that we have a fair, the new office, should that be an agency that takes more of a lead than city planning? Because I feel like the city planning, because of the focus on, basically looking at projects in general, approving projects, and then at the same time, because of all that, that could be potentially conflict of interest, or not interest in a conflict of interest in a way, but then in perspective of like the conflict perhaps within
Absolutely.
neighborhoods,
Yeah,
So
or
then
maybe it's
who puts a
both
check like
bodies.
that,
Mhm.
I'm not at all sure at this level of vagueness, it actually helps.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure referenda is the best way to deal with hugely complex issues that vary drastically according to what agency and what kinds of things you're talking about. Whether you even want more of them or whether or not you may, that's just, I mentioned this before. I just think it doesn't really necessarily help. It's just because, depending on what examples we pick, it means very different things. And it's still a judgment call, as you're saying.
Any other questions or comments on this one? Helpful points. Let's move on to meaningful or to fair care.
To an extent, we can discuss the two of these together, since they're similar concepts.
Yeah, so this one, fair care, is taking some of the value behind fair share, which is to ensure equitable distribution, and applying that to city services in a way that isn't necessarily done now, and especially is not done in the charter. So the way we've teed this proposal up is that there'd be a requirement to generate maps based on the worst outcomes, as well as looking at disparities, and do that sort of value by value, depending on what we identify in the preamble, let's say. So you could have a map for health and mental health outcomes, and then require agencies to prioritize and align their spending with the disparities identified in those neighborhoods, so as to ensure that there's some degree of agency prioritization of the neighborhoods that need the most help, and to buffer agencies a little bit from the, what is politically, pressuring them to devote services to an area, or some other factors such as, fiscal reasons to focus on one area over another. And we could contemplate this as fitting in with the citywide equity plan, including those maps and what's released with that larger plan, and showing how agencies are prioritizing those neighborhoods and how they spend and how they staff and how they service and how they contract.
Commissioner Davey.
Thank you. And I want to agree with number 2, but also raise a question about it. And that is, as I recall, there have been some studies that show that there are considerable city resources or government resources that go into otherwise under-resourced communities, but they're uncoordinated. And so you get a ton of money going into a neighborhood, but it's so uncoordinated that its impact is muted or blunted. So I would add the word coordination somewhere in number 2. So not only are you aligning and targeting, but there's some level of coordination suggested as well, if we're actually able to pull this off. I think it's a tall order for the city of New York to try to do this, but I think it's worthy of at least consideration.
And I think one of the functions contemplated in the Racial Equity Office is to provide exactly that coordinating role, and a place for city leaders to come together to discuss these issues of equity and how we can improve it in a joint way rather than at cross purposes.
I'll note that the closest place where this happens right now is actually through the Task Force for Racial Inclusion and Equity. There are neighborhoods that have been identified as sort of target neighborhoods. You saw some background when City of Sherman presented at the last commission meeting. So in many ways, this would be a sort of expansion of that concept and an updating of, which are the neighborhoods that we need to be focusing on at which point in time and why.
Right. Let me just add one point here, if I may, just Commissioner Thompson, is it okay? We do have to be careful with this one that it doesn't over time work against us. So an example that I'll provide for you is in foster care, in child welfare. For years, the city of New York would look at the the state clearance, the SCR reports, and would then dedicate greater resources to the communities where they saw the highest rate of reports. And then you in turn over time see that you have more removals and placement of children in foster care. And they'd say, well, it was tied to the number of reports that were coming from those communities. So you could look at that as an investment of resources in those communities, but it was actually working against the stabilization and the supports to families. Now, if you're applying a preventive approach, that's a different circumstance. The same thing can be said of the over surveillance and arrest rates, stop and frisk, over surveillance arrest rates in communities of color. It's not by mistake that in New York City, the 10 communities with the highest rates of low-income persons of color also correlate very much with the communities with the highest rates of arrest and incarceration. So we just have to be very careful about this because what can look like on its face like a good thing can turn very bad very quickly. Commissioner Thompson?
Yeah, I actually wanted to raise a similar caution with number 2. And the language require agencies, like all 40. That, and you require, and you're gonna review their spending and their staffing and their service levels for 40 agencies by neighborhood across this. That sounds like, you know, huge bureaucracy with all kinds of potentials for backfire, as you know, the chair just identified. And you know, one example I'm thinking, right now, there's a shooting gallery in Midtown Manhattan. And if you looked at the neighborhood demographics, it would not show up as a neighborhood that, you know, is racially disparate, with racial disparities and in need of more staffing and services, but it's a big time shooting gallery right now. And so staffing and stuff has to go there. So I would say, but so I would support 3 because I think we're asking the city or the mayor to actually look at the complexities of these things and come forward with a plan. If we put number 2, we're just saying, no, we're gonna have a bureaucratic mechanism to actually do that. And I just don't think that's the best route, personally.
Commissioner Holtec. Okay. Commissioner Yu.
Yeah, I think the first point already exists. In 2018, Local 06, as created by the City Council, signed into law by the mayor, required information required for healthcare, all these values across the neighborhoods. I was honored to be a part of it. I'm still are. It requires biannual reports on neighborhoods on healthcare disparities across a number of sections. It includes multiple health departments, including the OHMA, Health and Hospital Corporation, Health and Hospitals, and a number of other agencies who report to this committee. And then that report goes to the mayor and the city council. If you look at the last report, which was issued in 2020, in a pre-COVID environment, there was a lot of information about healthcare disparities on it. What we found as a committee, however, is that, to Commissioner Thompson's point, is that the complexities that go about redistributing resources go beyond that, just where the disparities exist. For instance, the neighborhood that had the highest incidence of smoking by individual on a per capita basis was in Chelsea at some point. But yet, most of the smoke-related deaths were in the South Bronx. You think you will want to have the services where most of the deaths are taking place, not where people are smoking most, so to speak, right? Similarly, people with diabetes were being treated more into like Bellevue Hospital and Jacoby at areas, even though most of them were in certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So people were getting care in places other than where the conditions existed. So to that end, I think this has to be revisited, and I support Commissioner Thompson's idea of number 3 as opposed to 1.
Commissioner Yu?
For number 2, I think there might be, as I understand it, there's an app under with the UICD where you type in your zip code and it kind of shows you where all the programs are. You know, that might be a way for us to look at like how effective has it been, like, you know, how will this play out? And I share all the concerns as well. But if there's something that we can review that's already in existence, that might, you know, be worth having a conversation with Commissioner Chong.
Are there questions on this one? Very helpful. We'll move forward. We're moving forward, everyone, just to page 20.
In case you haven't noticed, we did skip the break that we promised you. So if you need to use the restroom or anything, feel free to do so. We're not taking an official break unless you really want one.
We'll take a 2-minute break. We just got a few more proposals. We don't want to keep you long.
I mentioned break and you all seem a little,
2-3 minutes.
so we'll do it.
3 minutes.
I'm gonna get to the bathroom before Bill.
I'm making a run for it, except, hey, you know.
Then he goes beyond, he talks about child mortality. It has areas of, you know, the whole issue of feelings, you know,
Yes, yes.
This is very interesting.
Okay, okay, I've got goosebumps. You said, okay.
So all the stuff we crashing down. I'll send it. Okay.
Everywhere. Doing the work.
Yes, they're prayed up, they're locked in. It's been a struggle. I didn't realize it was something like that. Oh, I didn't know.
Like I saw, I just happened to.
Yeah, I gotta check it. I don't, I'm not on social media.
I know.
Enough, so I don't catch. But yeah, I talked to him all the time. I was son man, talking, you know.
But I don't, I forgot that.
Yeah.
But I didn't text them to be like, what do you need me to,
No,
what do you need?
I'm
You
gonna-
need to like show up to your house and cook your dinner.
Listen, I'm gonna let him know, and we gotta get together, because he's the one who first told me to get ready to.
I know, that's the first one too. He's like, I think you.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
I want to hear about this
No, absolutely.
governor thing too. So hard to hear.
No, it is.
Keep thinking it's and then the mask too, like all the work sort of in the.
Make sure the mic's off while we're talking.
No, I mean, just because they can hear chat. Yeah. I'm good, it's nice to see you. I don't think I've seen you in person. Have I? Oh, yeah, one, at least one. I know there was some, like, that you mentioned. Glad you could.
Yeah, and it's taking up a lot of my time. I'm listening on right now. Look, we had that restaurant gotta come to invite myself in here. The report's sort of 56 pages long. Yeah. And he goes from everything from correction, from mortality to most cancer exists, things like that. Yeah, that's gonna be a lot of fun.
I'm good. I don't think we've met in
glad we have.
Yeah, same here, same here. Yeah, and I hear you're not in the classroom. Yeah.
But definitely around every day.
Great.
I love the work you do.
Well,
Love the work
thank
at
you.
your university.
Thank you. Well, it'd be great to catch up there sometime. So where's your office?
Well, I live in Brooklyn, but the office,
Got it. All right, we are reconvened and we're going to pick up with the proposal titled Access for All. And everyone, when you speak, bring the mic close to you and speak into the mic because we're having problems picking up your voices.
Thank you. So this next proposal, Access for All, is thinking about how we can make sure that every agency prioritizes access and what their roles are in the city. It's not enough to create a service. It's not enough to just equitably distribute it. You have to make sure that people can meaningfully access it no matter what language they speak, no matter what their literacy is, no matter what physical needs they have. And that whatever process it takes to get that service is as simple as possible and not something that deters people from even trying to get a service because it just takes so long and so much expertise to get there. And so one way to do that could conceivably to create an office, such as like an office of access or office of service design, that serves as a centralized repository for all of those access design needs. So for example, if you need to know how to get something interpreted, you can go to this place. If you need to know how to make sure that it's written in plain language so that all New Yorkers can read it and so that it can be translated simply, then you can go to this place. If you want to design your meetings to be accessible or your video calls to be accessible, you can go to this place. So right now there are some groups in different offices that do this work, but you have to know of their existence and you have to know that you can go to them for this kind of service. And if they have time, they'll be able to help you. But one thing we could do is create a centralized place that has coordinated assistance, can do contracting, can do review, can be a centralized place to bring complaints or even to seek help, for example. So the proposal could have many different forms, and we can think about what access means to us and how best to represent that value in the city infrastructure in a way that it isn't necessarily right now.
Putting forth some of the questions for discussion, we want to hear, do you think this proposal warrants a separate office or department, or should it be structured as an obligation for every agency to prioritize access? And then also, what do we mean by access? Language justice, plain language, access for people with disabilities, and so on. And then I will pose the last question because we ended up discussing this a little bit under the Office of Racial Equity. Should this office be separate from or a component of that Office of Racial Equity or Office of Equity?
Commissioner Davey?
Yeah, that's the point I was going to raise, whether or not, particularly 1B, if we have this obligation for every agency, then could the Equity Office have responsibility for determining or assessing whether or not the agency is living up to the quote unquote obligation to provide maximum access.
And to your point, the concern that I have when you, if we were to go to the route of A, is this is my experience has been in city government when you are trying to implement create a new requirement, a responsibility, and you do it independent of the agency. The question always becomes, does it become part and parcel of what the agency does? If you're not integrating it into the work of the agency itself, if it sits independent, I'm saying it can go both ways, but is something really taking hold if you remove it from the agency's responsibilities? Commissioner Greta, and then Commissioner
Yeah, I
Hamilton.
have a question. So a few years back, when Local Law 30 was passed about language access, for
Mhm.
instance, it was required that each agency will get this plan, but the overall analysis will be done by the Office of Immigrant Affairs. And then over time, that changed in its application, to your point, Madam Chair, about, for instance, when we established an Office of 311 and what languages were accessible there as opposed to the 911 call. And what was found is that there were litigations that amended that. So I'm a little curious about, again, I don't necessarily believe that. I think you could do both in the sense that you can assign an agency to implement it, but if it's not part and partial to the core mission or an integrated mission to the individual agencies, it becomes more like a hollow exercise because you promulgate rules that are not followed by the agency.
Right.
And I specifically, I want to talk about just the access of social services and health and human services as an example, right? People in need for, Medicaid, food stamps, other efforts that are under the HRA, where people were not only hurt by not having the access to the language, but actually got hurt by the lack of understanding within the formation of a consistent plain language that allow people to, apply for something and then be denied because they just didn't understand what it is. So I think that, I don't think that necessarily we need to create an office. I think you could assign an office, but I think if it's not part of the core mission of the other, it means nothing.
Commissioner Hamilton?
You stated it very well, so I can pass.
Commissioner Thompson?
Either the one or two charter revision commissions ago, there was a new agency set up called the Citizens Engagement Commission. And one of their responsibilities is like language access. So they coordinate the translation, say, during elections at all the polling sites, for example. They're trying to build their capacity to do more citizen engagement work, which I think is a lot of this. So we may not necessarily need to create a whole new thing. And I think the intent of the previous charter was to address this. So that's worth looking at. And there's also a public engagement unit that was created out of the mayor's office with several hundred employees. And all they do is go out to folks and say, did you know you're eligible for the child tax credit? Did you know you're eligible for this housing, get that housing thing? And they do it, in multiple languages. That's all they do. So anyway, there may be, this may be something that doesn't necessarily call for a charter change.
Great. There is another existing component of the Office of NYC Opportunity, which is a service design studio that will work with agencies to rethink processes, the ways that people might apply for affordable housing, for example, I think was one project. So that's another place where there exists some capacity. What a scaling up could look like could be something new, or it could be the amplifying of what already exists. I want to make sure that the component of program design and redesign is considered here, that there are so many sort of administrative burdens and challenges that people face in applying for all sorts of things, which is not exactly public or citizen engagement, but is thinking about the user experience and anyone that New York City serves.
Commissioner Yu?
So I don't want to go into detail because my office has actually been working on this with a couple of nonprofits. But I think, one of the things that we have to think about when we talk about reducing wage disparity is that whenever we do anything like this, I think, the city tends to work with, the big language providers, the translation providers, right? But we have to remember there's a lot of talent in New York City, and there's a lot of immigrants who bring language skills, right? It's so there is a group that is working on this. We've been working on it for a while to try to figure out something for the state and the city, but it is the New York Immigration Coalition, us, MASA, and then African communities together. We need to think about what African immigrant languages, those are languages that are really diffuse. And so there's a lot of very educated people coming here, and it's a way for them to be able to utilize their everyday skills to be able to make a living. So, I'd love to talk offline with you about the proposals that we have, because I think, whenever we talk about language access, I'm always a little frustrated that we resort to, services that have no reflection of real life language. So I think we need to utilize the resources and to build internal capacity internally in the city.
Are there other comments on this one? I'll just, if we give this further consideration, we may want to figure out how to be more explicit and more descriptive, as well as center on whether or not we're talking about just services and supports. It reads very much like it's services and supports, but what are we saying about access to contracting, access to contracts with the city for a variety of services that maybe are not of a human service nature, right? It reads more like an individual access and less, access to SBS capital, access to contracts for government services.
To that point, I don't know if it's legal or not, and I'd like to inquire whether that access also involves pension investments. Because some years ago, I remember prior to being when I became a member of the board, there was a promulgation of a rule that I questioned regarding agencies that had to start with a portfolio no more than $500 million to even be considered for some of the investments. That left a lot of groups who might have been great, minority-owned firms who did not raise to that value to be, in my opinion, excluded from the discussion on investments on multi-billion-dollar institutions. And I've seen that in contracting too, where you immediately set a criteria for pre-qualification of contracts and says, well, this is the criteria, and a lot of the people who are doing really good work who could potentially do it further and could realize a larger potential were excluded from the conversation. And then what only left up to be able to appeal the decision, which was appealed to the same group that denied them in the first place. So I think that language access is important. I think access for people with disabilities is important. But what about access to capital? Real access to economic development, right? Real access to be able to leverage things. And I think if that's the premise, Madam Chair, that is access in that respect, this is worth probably separating into two to give it its due weight, as opposed to having a one catch-all phrase
Fair.
that allows.
Fair. And even looking also at education.
Education.
Okay. Yep. Okay, good. All right. We've got another 20 minutes or so. And so I think we've got two more proposals. Rock and roll. Thank you all.
So the first part of our anti-marginalization proposal set is an anti-marginalization mandate. So one would be to amend the NYPD's mission in the charter to center on a holistic definition of public safety. The second one would be a mandate for all agencies to proactively identify alternatives to not just policing, but also other punitive measures wherever possible to reverse mass incarceration and the criminalization of poverty. And then lastly, the equity plan has to reflect equity, strategies to reduce marginalization. So really the thrust of this is to make sure that every agency knows that it's part of their role to counter the effects of marginalization and to look for ways to not inflict punitive measures on people as a first resort.
Thoughts?
Question, the mental health aspect of this on the criminalization is one that comes to mind. It was had in prior to coming here, a meeting about the access to mental health services in public hospitals and their connection to sort of like the criminal system, right? There was a case of a person who had mental health issues who was picked up by the police and was put through the criminal system, but there was never any referral to any of the city mental health issues in order to address it. I'm wondering if it is specific mention of access to mental health as an important aspect of it. If you look at the data of those who are incarcerated in many of the neighborhoods, there's a large percentage of autism, for instance, and other issues that should be. And I'm wondering if that should be also mentioned as part of it, so that you're not only reducing it for reducing its sake, but you're also guiding us to one way that you can help in the Health and Human Services that Commissioner you was mentioning. So that's just a suggestion.
Commissioner Bermudez, then we'll go to Commissioner Davey.
You know, when in the beginning of this administration, there was a task force on behavioral health and criminal justice, where there had been suggested a series of efforts and initiatives to bifurcate or to separate calls to the NYPD that were a result of a person in emotional distress, so that the response wouldn't be the cops, right? And would be some other system or combination. I don't know if, can we create in the charter, like mandate an alternative to a 911 system to be a 711 system or something like that, to channel those, to create a whole different system of addressing those issues. Or I don't know, it just seems that would be a more concrete way of dealing with these issues, or then go back to that task force report and see whether we can charter some of those, ideas, because otherwise.
So we just created a pilot on this, right, for the first time. And it's been rolled out now, so that when you call 911, instead of a police unit, it's a specialized unit with a social worker and an EMT, a lieutenant captain that's going to attend those calls if it's identified as a mental health call. I was specifically talking more after the fact.
Afterward, okay.
So that if somebody gets arrested, put through the criminal system, that they're not just continue to that prison pipeline, but actually have services after they're incarcerated. I'm gonna say it, many of the people that my members are servicing, when asked, sometimes they need a place to stay. They need a hot meal. And unfortunately, they get it in the jails that they can't get it in the homeless shelter. It's sad, but it's true, right? And so people get put through the system, right? And the system's already overwhelmed. I think that it's not just at the point where the dispatch happens, but after the fact as well.
Commissioner Davey?
Sure, thank you. I guess I'm curious as to how we are defining marginalization. Is it just mass incarceration and criminalization of poverty? Or are there other aspects of sort of living in New York that fall under marginalization that agencies have oversight over? And if there are, then do we need to think about how we include those too? Or to say it more succinctly, maybe we just need to more clearly define what we mean by marginalization.
You raise a good point. I was sitting here thinking about the example that I provided earlier, foster care. That's a way that, families have been marginalized. Probation is another, instrument that has been used to deny someone, not under Commissioner Bermudez, but in years past.
I'm sorry?
I said not under you, but in years past.
Probation, sure.
Right, but perhaps I think we need to be looking at that very question. I'm concerned. Commissioner Hamilton, do you have a thought?
So I'm really skeptical with number one. Number two, I could use a little more clarity. Number three, I have the greatest affinity towards. And again, with the caveat on the language of marginalization, as was pointed out by Commissioner Davey. But number 3 seems consistent with redirecting city resources in a way that is more efficient in handling problems than necessarily criminalizing it and promoting mass incarceration. Number 1, I like the accountability in that, but it runs the risk of expanding the domain and the power of an entity for which we might be already clamoring is too powerful to begin with.
I'm going to just share that I do think that there is value in an anti-marginalization mandate. And, appreciating your point, Commissioner Hamilton, maybe it's really sits in 3. That there must be some demonstration on the part of all city agencies to, to put forth plans and indicators of efforts to, they have to define, as I'm saying, I'm speaking. As I'm speaking, I'm thinking about this because, like how we may define marginalization may be different than how any one of us may be different than another, or a city agency may not see what they do as marginalizing. And so we have to give that some thought.
I might add, in addition to clearly defining what we mean by marginalization, that's incredibly important for any sort of enforcement. So bringing in the discussion questions, thinking about what happens if an agency fails to prioritize anti-marginalization, or if they further it through some action. What happens? Is that built into the equity plan process? So something to think on and share thoughts if you have any.
So there's an entire economy, as we're all familiar with, built around this prison industrial complex. And so when we talk about accountability or restructuring it, the incentive to incarcerate people is real. So I think part of the solution lies in figuring out ways to measure something other than the historical approach to policing. So when we talk to law enforcement in our community, they say, well, there is no brownie points or gold stars or goldfish for helping, de-escalate a conflict, for example. There's no place that exists towards your promotion. But if you make X amount of arrests, you interrupt felonies, then you are on a pathway and a trajectory to be successful in the police department. So I think part of what's needed here is to look at what does it look like to incentivize some of this holistic anti-marginalization language and approach that is positioned in front of us.
I want to say amen to Commissioner Bain's comments.
I'll just comment on that and say that one thing we're envisioning the equity plan and the equity indicators to accomplish is when every agency has to determine what sort of outcomes are related to equity and figure out how to improve those outcomes and how to improve that disparity, then they may be incentivized to create sort of individual indicators of success that also align with equitable service and actually supporting the community. It isn't a guarantee, but it's just one mechanism that we can kind of push agencies toward that way of measurement and reward and assessment.
Madam Chair, at the risk of talking too much tonight, I just want to say that's great for most agencies. I think the NYPD is an unusual agency, given its size, its budget, its authority. And I think it's going to take a little bit more focus on what's expected in terms of the comments that Commissioner Bain made, in ways that perhaps you would not have to do that with other agencies.
Perhaps the building on your third proposal, we can write into the specifics around the citywide equity plan that, you know, one of the elements to be addressed and to be captured in the plan is, you know, an assessment of the activities of agencies that work with communities, persons and communities of color, and the policies and the programs that that, you know, serve to perpetuate, to marginalize and perpetuate inequity, and then efforts to overcome that. Commissioner Hamilton.
I'm gonna plus one that, and then also maybe add something.
I'm sorry, you're gonna.
Plus one,
Oh,
so I'm
okay,
with you.
okay, oh, plus one. I didn't hear what you said.
And sorry, I guess I need to take this down. And then, you know, there's the statistical problem that's brought up with the census as we think about mass incarceration and counting people and measurement and our equity plans. Can we also think about the ways in which neighborhoods have needs in terms of resources, and it's not adequately measured because of incarceration, so that we can think about populations that are not there right now, but will come back and have implications on resources.
Excellent point. Other comments on this one? We'll move on.
Okay, this next component relates to how people can return to their communities and thrive despite contact with the criminal legal system. Let's say it's arrest, let's say it's trial, let's say it's conviction, let's say it's incarceration. So the proposal here is to figure out how we can best prohibit the use of criminal background checks and criminal history in situations where employers, situations where landlords, people granting licenses might use that information to deny access to someone. One option is to limit that to the scope of the city and, you know, expand the laws in place that regulate how this sort of history can be used in employment contexts. And another option would be to go even further than the city and expand rules that apply to private entities and how they hire and house and so forth. There's an existing Fair Chance Act in the city that says if you apply for a job, you can't even mention a background check or perform a background check until a conditional offer. But after that conditional offer is made, you can use that information. And that's for the employment context. So this proposal would potentially expand beyond that context to how agencies provide services or make other sorts of decisions, and potentially beyond.
Yes. Commissioner Garrido.
I have to say for the record, I have some serious concern with this proposal. And I'm gonna try to go through some of it, right? For instance, right now in the school system, we have a system which identifies individuals who identify themselves as having had a criminal violation. And one of the first consideration is any kind of child molestation or child abuse to work with children, right? Similarly, we have the same criteria for people who have been convicted of embezzlement or things like that and handling money, finances. So I think the intent is we don't want to see discrimination for people who are being formerly incarcerated. That's one thing. But I think to say that you're prohibiting outright, it's a bridge too far. And it certainly creates a situation where one would think that you are giving institutions who have been found guilty in the past of violating the very same thing that they will be involved with. Contractors constantly get debarred for stealing wages from workers, right? And they get prosecuted. Would we want to then say, well, you can't apply for something where you're living up to your penalty of being debarred? Those are felony charges. So I think I have some serious problems with this. proposal.
If I could clarify, this is designed as a bar with exceptions, and we would envision, given an entity, and there are options as to which entity, the ability to determine when use of criminal bars may be necessary. But the default would be that they would be banned, that you can't utilize them unless there's a demonstration that they are necessary, such as in the examples that you shared.
So let me interject here. This proposal is in some ways tied with the previous proposal, because this speaks to marginalization. This speaks to individuals who have been incarcerated, have served their time, yet, return to live, in New York City, but cannot get a job. They cannot get a license. They're prohibited. And so it's the perpetuation of the marginalization. It's the rules and the laws have been designed in such a way that once you become justice involved, you are essentially now assigned to a life. It's like, you wear the scarlet letter of having once been incarcerated, and it keeps you from establishing a livelihood, and being a full citizen of the city. And so the aim of this is to try to remove not just the stigma, but the actual structures that allow for this. It's the same, it's very much like disenfranchisement, right? The laws are in parts of the country that are, in some places, are now being undone, where once you were convicted of a crime and were established to be a felon, you could no longer vote. That's marginalization. And so it's trying to get at that, appreciating that disproportionately it is Black and brown men who are incarcerated. And so once this happens, when you have these rules in place, they're not able to be gainfully employed and in places and positions that allow them to earn a decent living. That's my thinking about how you all are thinking about this. The question that I ask is, I appreciate the point that you're making. Could we consider determining that justice involvement cannot be dispositive? Cannot be dispositive or the determinative factor. That it might be a factor, but it cannot be conclusive. Do you see the point that I'm making?
Like the distinction. It's a
Right.
distinction between the two.
Right.
And I think forgive me, what you're saying and what I'm looking at, this is two different.
Okay.
things, right? If you limit somebody's ability to get a job, right, or apply for housing or something like that, absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. But I think in the criteria on the qualifications for providing services for city, for instance, there ought to be a criteria to establish under the merit and fitness whether somebody is able to do the job or not. And if what I'm concerned is about using very strong words like prohibiting right out, right, without an opportunity. I think Anusha mentioned some provisos to that. I think what you're saying versus what's here are completely two different things. And by the way, my union represents a cohort of folks that are formerly incarcerated, that we're helping them to get good paying jobs in areas like BEP that otherwise will not have access to good paying jobs. And I'm very proud of the work we've done around this. And I think we should do more. But I also think there's a reality in the way that we qualify people, that if you don't allow agencies to have some sort of a judgment or criteria without discriminating, that you're setting yourself up for a problem. Potential litigations by parents, potential litigations by individuals, when you use words that are so definitively like prohibiting that kind of work. And that, I think that's my concern.
That's fair. Commissioner Hamilton?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to go on the other side and say, I think the unless demonstrated to be necessary is a useful proviso.
Okay.
And I like that in conjunction with prohibit. And I would actually recommend that we expand it. I think the principle is that similar to redlining, attributes aside from race are used in making decisions that are very race almost intentional, or whether it's intentional or not is almost irrelevant, but have race affect that are not necessary for the attribute that's being considered in the first place. And the example I would add, in addition to criminal background, could be something like credit scoring. That a lot of times decisions introduce credit scores, which we can go into why they're so racially disparate, and they actually have a lot to do with the racial wealth gap that exists in general. So I think the use of criminal background, the use of credit scoring, and if the proposal can be made even more broadly to use metrics that have race affect or gender affect that are not necessary or not necessary for the endeavor, I think becomes a nice proposal. And as it relates to number two, if you can't do it with regards to private entities in terms of prohibiting, I'd say you consider city contracting, or if you're going to do business with the city, you got to do good practices, including not discriminating based on criminal background when it's not necessary.
Good deal.
I have a lot to say, but I'm gonna defer to my sister Anna.
Right, but I'll be quick, because I do have a thought about how to sort of massage this a little bit, if you will, because I take the access piece to be like ban the box. It's not like we're suggesting to prohibit using it at any point in time, but in that initial, foot in the door kind of thing, it is my interpretation. I'm not going to address Commissioner Hamilton's point directly, but I agree with the credit scores, all these irrelevant things that have so much history of discrimination, right? What about though, if we say, basically that you're not allowed to use it as that first, similar to whatever the ban the box language is, right? And then that you can't use anything that's more than 10 years old, because that is part of some of the law already, to be a dispositive hiring, criterion, unless it's directly related to one of the job, what Henry was saying, it's directly to a job requirement or whatever. And that way because I don't know if you guys read this the other day in the New York Times, but it was about foster care and how this is affecting families of children to be able to be resourced to take care of, like there was a grandparent who was not approved. The kid could live there, but they were not giving them resources at all because he had a conviction 25 years ago. I mean, really. And this poor child then is growing up in a family now that's strapped for resources that could be getting resources, all because something that happened 25 years ago. And so it's crazy to me. So this really spoke to me on that piece as well. And if we can craft it in a way that we can touch on all the concerns around this, that would be great. But we just keep spiraling then, compounding, convictions that have already all sorts of issues with them anyway, to then be bars to continued mobility and a life.
This is why it's important to defer to wisdom, because then there's less work to be done when you just sit back and allow the leadership to lead. So thank you for that. I would just say, prison is the punishment. A lot of time we forget that. I think the unions, while they're doing work, it's not even close to significantly enough. Until you got 60, 70,000 people coming home every year. I mean, there's so much could be said. I want to know, is Article 23A working? Is it not? What's happened with the conditional offer of employment? How could we look at that to say what's necessary next step? What does it look like? What shouldn't it look like? What have we done right with regard to this? Where are we? That would be my question.
So this is one I think requires, we need to spend some more time with this one. Yeah, I just go back to the intent here is to address and bring about change concerning, the continued essentially oppression of people of color, using the penal system and mass incarceration to essentially lift up and out of their communities, people of color, and then to essentially assign them forevermore to a life of, being destitute and their families, the inability to provide and support for their families. This is the structural piece here.
Madam Chair,
If I can
think-
forever
think
put a letter on
clear.
on your chest.
That's clear. I think that the tens of thousands that researchers have shown us of barriers ascribed to someone who is formerly incarcerated. I think that's there. I think the devil is in the details. For example, I work in an industry where we have credible messengers who interrupt violence. And so I have people literally on my staff who have been convicted of murder more than once. And so that's the rap sheet. Yet and still, if you have been convicted of domestic violence, you're not someone who could work. So the devil is in the details. And so when the vice chair explains, in certain industries, this will be a problem. I think, again, the devil is in the details, and that specificity is important.
Agreed.
But I understand, and I think we understand the importance of, what mass incarceration has been allowed to do to communities of color to present day. The $262 billion industry that it is, the 11.4 million people that go in and out of county jails, the 2.4, all of that is, I think, in our faces. It's just, again, how do we approach it in a way that is effective? And has what we've done to date been effective on what level? If not, then what needs to be changed with it?
Points well taken. Okay. I think that we are pretty much.
We have one more.
One more.
The last proposal to discuss in particular today is about accountability for Department of Correction, and in particular, trying to figure out how to create enforceability of rights for persons in custody. The bigger picture here is that people should not lose their humanity just because they're incarcerated. They shouldn't lose their rights to basic health, mental health, and other services that they need to live like a human being. And so are there enforcement mechanisms that we can create to empower either a person in custody or the Board of Correction or someone else to enforce those rights specifically? That's what's on the table to discuss now. Discuss some questions as well.
Madam Chair, I'd be in favor of suggesting both of these, that it's incorporated in the jurisdiction of the racial equity entity that we set up, as well as in the Board of Corrections. I mean, if what I read is true, and I've never been to Rikers, it's the fact that the story could even be told in a in almost the sort of first quarter of the 21st century is beyond a disgrace. And any mechanisms for greater accountability that are reasonable, I think we should support them. And doesn't seem to me that if both the equity entity as well as the Board of Corrections have the authority to look at this issue, that would be excessive at all. Let me just say, one more word about this, and there are people here who know this work better than I. But, the whole notion of penitentiary obviously comes from the word penitent, where people are supposed to be put in conditions where they can, make a turn, make a change. And I don't want to be naive or Pollyannish about sort of human nature and the ability of bad people to do bad things. But if we don't, we owe it to people to give them a chance,
Yes.
to have a chance. And right now, we don't do that. And anything that we can do to address it that is going to be effective in and through this commission, I would support. So I could see both of these entities having some responsibility for what goes on in terms of conditions under which people live in prisons and jails in New
Very
York
much
City.
appreciated and agreed.
This is not directly on the private right of action piece, although I don't love that, honestly, but I know where it's going and I want to think more like about how to get there in terms of accountability. I don't know, Jennifer, you would know more than this and more about this in terms of the alternative of empowering the Board of Correction more. The other thing is that the Board of Correction, I was just looking at the charter, does not have any quote unquote qualifications for the members. There's no requirement that formerly incarcerated people or their families be represented in the Board of Corrections. And I think that's something we could put in, to give more of like a diversity of, and a potential language, copy is the city council put together a commission on community reinvestment for, communities affected by mass incarceration. And it lays out sort of like a number of people that must be on the commission. That could be, a guide for changing a little bit the language here. But I would like to consider what options we have for empowering the Board of Correction.
So just recently, we've gotten some information along those lines, some ideas that
The what? I'm sorry.
there are some ideas that are percolating there. And so we can share them. Just FYI, there are members of the board that have been formerly incarcerated. The real issue with the Board of Correction is the lack of enforceability. You can promulgate rules, but the city can override them. With just like just with the signature on a piece of paper. We've reviewed the proposals. I don't know how much time, I don't know, we have to run out of here in like 2 minutes. Is that,
Yeah,
I think we got.
We don't have a lot of time. We want to let the good folks who've been hosting us here let us go. But I will point out that, we haven't really gotten into the discussion questions here. I'll put forth that, we could schedule perhaps a virtual commission meeting. Should we desire even next week to get deeper into these discussion questions? Haven't discussed that with anyone else here. We of course are happy to hear any input that you have that you want to share privately between meetings, share directly with the staff or with our chair or vice chair. So we're always open, want to hear your thoughts, particularly, now that we've gone through all of the proposals, in total, do you feel like this is moving us in the direction that we want to be moving in as a city? After we've gone through everything, are there proposals that you would prioritize or change significantly? I think we've already identified a number of places where additional information will be helpful as we've gone through those. So we will follow up with that information once it's ready. And think on the last question of what's not here and why, and what do we do with that?
So let me jump in here and just piggyback on the suggestion that you made concerning another meeting. We are 3 weeks out from taking action on the proposals. And there's more work, a lot more work to be done. The staff have done a tremendous job, as evidenced by the conversation had here tonight. There's some more work that they've got to do on specific proposals that we've talked about where we have questions or we have other considerations we'd like them to explore. We need to get back together as a body and have another follow-up conversation to this. So I'm going to suggest that we look at trying to do something. Well, next week is Thanksgiving. I don't know if people's schedules allow for a Monday evening. Can we do this virtually?
We can do it virtually.
I'm going to ask you all to think about that. If we can find a 90-minute period, you all can come over to my house and cook with me. And
Say end of
Getting dinner, Jennifer.
we could do it the end of this weekend, this week, perhaps Thursday evening or Friday evening, if that gives you all time to do some follow-up. The other challenge that we have, the question that we have to center on is how many proposals? Is it all of this? I mean, the way that they put these together, you kind of tells a story and it touches upon very critical issues. Is there a way that you bring all of this together and you present it in a few proposals, or do you knock certain things out? And a lot of that may be determined by the additional research and workup of the proposals. So I'm putting that out here to you all. We have to get out of here, but perhaps maybe if we could ask for some type of doodle survey or something to find out if people are available for, I would suggest about a 90-minute period. And then Monday, we could do Friday or Monday. If people want to take a quick look.
Absolutely. We'll reach out first thing in the morning to begin scheduling. Or we could do it right now.
I think they're.
Friday or Monday?
I'm available.
Friday's not gonna work for me.
Okay, does Monday evening?
Friday does not.
Monday evening could work.
Monday could work virtually.
4:30 to 6.
Okay.
Does that work?
What's me?
Joanne, do you,
Wait, what are we doing? Monday?
I think I'm traveling with that on Monday, but I can call in.
Yeah, this would be virtual anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, phone is fine. And we'll check with commissioners Mata and Daniel Favors as well.
all right.
Okay.
I get, so in the potential of a Monday meeting or our next meeting, we will be able to revisit some of these questions of, do we have an adequate amount of proposals on the table? Are there
Yes,
things that, okay.
yes, yes. What would be helpful, if you have thoughts concerning that, if you see that there are glaring omissions, a glaring omission or an overemphasis on something else, whatever may be the case. If you can let your thoughts be known in advance, that then allows us to do some more, allows them to do some more work in advance. So like if you have thoughts and ideas about what's not here and for what requires further consideration beyond what we've talked about today, if you can just send a note, an email, and if you have supporting documentation to Anusha and to Jimmy in the next 2 days so that they can do some work between now and then, that would be great. Between now and our meeting on Monday. Good deal? Okay, very, very much appreciate all of your time today, commissioners. We know we've kept you longer, but I think it was a very worth the time well spent. And I want to thank again all of the staff for your tireless efforts. We're in the home stretch, and I think we're in a good position. We're in a good position. Thank you all, and have a good night. Meeting is adjourned.
And see most of you on Thursday at our public input session.
What are we doing Thursday?